Salvete omnes! Salvete omnes! Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast and recording is to get in, for the record, day 295 of the project, Apocatastasis Unified History, Literature, Philosophy, and Art Curricula. And we are getting into the very last part of the 19th century chapter today on literature. This is entitled The Fruit of an Age. And that's what you want to think about art as, whether that's the specific art of literature or any of the other expressions of the soul. Just as a tree draws the sustenance out of the soil and produces a fruit, likewise an age draws the sustenance from the souls and the minds and the hearts of people and produces various works of art as the fruit, as we say, of an age, of a generation. So we're looking in particular at literature. Before we get too long in the tooth, let's get some background music going and we'll get into our advertisement for this class. Of course, the opening was Midnight Sonata by Beethoven. No doubt some bastard attorney is going to claim the copyright on that. And nothing you're going to be able to do about that. I hope you're not catching this every day on YouTube. YouTube is just a funnel for us to get people over to BitChute and Rumble. All right. So I can live with that, and so can you. All right, let's take a look what we have here for our ad, and then we'll carry on there. This is being broadcast later than typical, just because it's been a day. I'll just leave it there. It has been a day. And so what normally should get done at about 9 o'clock in the morning is getting done at 9 in the evening or thereabouts. We had some staff meetings today. I had to drive people around. I'm trying to deal with some back of the house headaches, which actually is appropriate to my advertisement here. And it has to do with an address I lately gave called True to the Last. And once it queues up here, I will say my piece. So up towards the top of this beautiful site, our main page, you'll see this video. And if it's not atop the page when you happen to come across this presentation, it'll be on the site, somewhere on the main page. But it's True to the Last on collegiality. And just taking this opportunity, because of some back of the house stuff, like I say, to reiterate that Apocatastasis is a home for all scholars. We will not throw anyone under the bus. We are formed. People can have all sorts of ideas. They can have all sorts of disagreements. And we're not endorsing each other at Apocatastasis. We're not trying to convince each other of anything. What we're trying to do is to develop a really vibrant learning community. And at the core of this message, True to the Last on collegiality, that's what I really try to lay home and drive home, is this idea that every single one of us at the college, whether we're formally enrolled as students or staff, or in a more distant relationship, we can all say and act how we want to, and we can be ourselves, and we're going to treat the other person well, and we're going to have charity for them and patience for opinions we don't agree with. That's apocatastasis. This is what we call being liberal, not in any sort of political sense, but having a mind that's well-rounded, that's nuanced, and that can take disagreements and not have meltdowns. And so I encourage you to take a look at this. We say that we're restoring education. Apokatastasis means restoration in Greek. Part of that is we have to stop seeing the other person as an enemy, and people who have different beliefs and different takes on things and whatever, as the other and as the foe. And I will not cease to advocate for that, and I will not cease to take any and every opportunity to do so. And so I encourage you to check that out. And then while you're at it, check out everything else on the site, our course catalog, our pilgrimage coming up. Busy days, these summer days at Apocatastasis. And they say teachers get the summer off. Have you heard that? Have you heard that lie? Have you heard that nonsense? So teachers get the summer off, do they? I'm more busy now than when I have a full teaching course load. It's amazing, actually. I mean, so I don't have that much teaching going on in the summer months. I'm doing all the back of the house, and I wonder, how did I get it all done when I had, and as I will have come the fall, once again, a full teaching schedule. How did I do all the administrative stuff? I mean, stuff built up, that's fair. I guess we have more, special events during the summer, so that takes energy that I don't need to expend during the rest of the year. But you do wonder, I'm sure you parents wonder this, with your jobs and your children and things. Where did I come up with the minutes to do all this stuff? Now, when did all the time go as well? Anyway, let's get our poem under our belt now that we have our advertisement scene too. We're looking at literature today, The Fruit of an Age. And so we have no shortage whatsoever here. In fact, we have such a, an embarrassment of riches that we don't even have a secondary article. This last section, the 18th section of the chapter on the 19th century, is plenty for us. It's a tour de force. This last section is a tour de force of the 19th century and of this very topic, that most literary of centuries. All right. But we have Lord Alfred Douglas's Wine of Summer. Speaking of the 19th century, Lord Douglas was involved in probably the greatest scandal of that age, certainly in Britain, and that, of course, was the dalliance that he had and that was made public with Oscar Wilde. Rather sordid affair, the trials of Oscar Wilde, involving his love affair with Alfred Douglas in a roundabout way, in a libel lawsuit, something I know quite a bit about because it forms the background of a poem I used to perform and still do perform every Lent, called The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Anyway, this is Alfie, the Wine of Summer. The sun holds all the earth and all the sky from the gold throne of this midsummer day. In the soft air, the shadow of a sigh breathes on the leaves and scarcely makes them sway. The wood lies silent in the shimmering heat, save where the insects make a lazy drone. And ever and anon, from some tree near, a dove's enamored moan. Or distant rock's faint crong, harsh and sweet, comes dimly floating to my listening ear. Right in the wood's deep heart I lay me down and look up at the sky between the leaves. Through delicate lace I see her deep blue gown. Across a furred a scarlet spider weaves. From branch to branch a slender silver thread. And hangs there shining in the white sunbeams. A ruby tremulous on a streak of light. And high above my head, one spray of honeysuckle sweats and dreams, with one wild honeybee for acolyte. My nest is all untrodden, virginal, and virginal the path that led me here, for all along the grass grew straight and tall, and live things rustled in the thicket near, and briar rose stretched out to sweet briar rose, wild, slender arms, and barred the way to me with many a flowering arch, rose pink or white, as bending carefully, leaving unbroken on their blossoming boughs, I passed along, a reverent neophyte. The air is full of soft imaginings, they float unseen beneath the hot sunbeams, like Tired moths on heavy velvet wings, they droop above my drowsy head like dreams. The hum of bees, the murmuring of doves, the soft, faint whisperings of unnumbered trees mingle with unreal things, and low and deep, from visionary grooves, imagined lutes make voiceless harmonies, and false flutes sigh before the gates of sleep. O rare, sweet hour, O cup of golden wine! The night of these my days is dull and dense, and stars are few, but be this my anodyne. Of many woes the perfect recompense, I thought that I had lost forevermore the sense of this ethereal drunkenness, this fierce desire to live, to breathe, to be. But even now, no less than in my merry noon that danced before my tea just night, I tasted in ecstasy, taste and remember all the summer days that lie like golden reflections in the lake of vanished years, unreal but sweet always, soft, luminous shadows that I may not take into my hands again, but still discern, drifting like gilded ghosts before my eyes beneath the waters of forgotten things, sweet with faint memories. Yeah, 2 more stanzas and it'll be through. Okay. All right, we get it. The summer's cool. All right, carrying on. Last 2 stanzas. And mellow with old loves that used to burn dead summer days ago, like fierce red kings, to this hour too must die. Even now the sun droops to the sea, and with untroubled feet the quiet evening comes. The day is done, the air that throbbed beneath passionate heat grows calm and cool and virginal again. The color fades and sinks to somber tones, as when in youthful cheeks a blush grows dim. Hushed are the monotones of doves and bees, and long flowery lane rustles beneath the wind in playful whim. Gone are the passions and the pulse that beat with fevered strokes, and gone the unseen things that clothe the hour with shining raiment meet to deck enchantments and imaginings. No joy is here, but only neutral peace and loveless languor and indifference, the faint remembrance of lost ecstasy. The darkening shades increase, my dreams go out like tapers. I must hence. Far off I hear night calling to the sea. Thus is Sir Alfred Douglas's Wine of Summer. All right, you should have laid off Oscar for a bit and just done poetry. You'd have been better off for it. But anyhow, the high schoolers had never forgiven me for showing The Happy Prince, but it had to be done. It had to be done. All right. So here we are, and that was our poem. And now we hop along, Cassidy, into our text here from Wells. We've, as I say, no shortage of material. And I thought it would most appropriate that Wells concluded this extended meditation on the 19th century with a look at, let's see here, they changed all the buttons here, you see, on StreamYard, so I'm trying to change the camera on. It's like a haunted house here. You don't know where you're turning, where you're clicking on, but this should do the trick. But yeah, we have no shortage of material here, and I thought it, yes, indeed, most appropriate that he ended on this topic of literature here. I have some notes here as well, because there's so much. And what I wanted to begin with was the notice that Wells ends this whole chapter on, and that is 1914 is beckoning. Let's in fact begin with the last paragraph here, because it's very important that we put things in context. Now, Wells has already established that the 19th century is not 1800 to 1900, let's say, but rather 1815, the Congress of Vienna, to 1914, the Great War. And it's loomed in various selections of Wells so far, and we see it continue now as well. And he says the disappearance, let's just cite this proper. I'm debating when we start this up again in August from the top. Will I just use the PDF? It's a lot clearer, but it doesn't have the hominess of the doc cam. Anyway, the disappearance of ancient civilization and the beginning of the Dark Ages was certainly a calamity. He's comparing 1914 to the fall of the Western Empire in the previous page. But it was foreseeable. The fall of Rome was foreseeable and unavoidable. A calamity. Ancient civilization was almost dead already. The empire had fallen upon itself before the barbarians gave the final push. It was exhausted. If its end is to be compared to anything in nature, it is to the death of a very old man. The fall of the Roman Empire in the West was like the death of a very old man. You knew it's coming. But the disaster of 1914 is more like the slaughter of a young and strong man. Science, art, literature, and all that makes up a civilization were rising to greater heights than ever before. They were checked, and in some cases driven back, by this man-made catastrophe. For the slaughter that started in 1914 was a selective slaughter, unlike the Black Death. It was the young and healthy that were killed and maimed, and that on a scale never known before. No man can travel in France today, for example, and not notice the numberless war memorials on which are engraved an unending series of names, more sometimes in number than the present population of the villages. There were 3 young poets in England of outstanding promise, Brooke, Sorley, Owen, and all were killed. And how many others unknown, artists, scientists, writers, lawyers, statesmen, were also slain. It was commonplace to speak of a missing generation for the next quarter century. And it goes on. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis. I just wanted to begin this extended, as I say, this extended meditation on the literacy of the 19th century with the Great War. And one of the most formative books in my life, and certainly my professional training, was The Great War in Modern Memory by Paul Fussell. I have a special anniversary edition which is illustrated. Unfortunately, it was a little bit rushed in publication and has a number of typos, particularly in the latter parts of the book, but it is a gem nonetheless, one of my real treasures. The Great War in Modern Memory. We'll look at that again, but Fussell basically contrasts, almost as a photo negative of this section, he contrasts the literacy of men in the Great War with what comes after, just as this builds up to the culture that led into that. Now, he begins this, I'm not even going to read this, but he begins this section with a panoply of philosophers, Malthus and Schopenhauer, Hegel, and again, he says, we do not have time to get into. We do not have time to get into. Well, guess what? Here at ApocatastasIs, we do. And that's the genius of the project, is that we can take a reference and develop it. And you're going to see that a lot more when we begin from scratch this August 31st. Here we have Lord Byron, who only gets a paragraph. Here, we can spend a whole week on Lord Byron if needs be. Lord Byron, who writes Ozymandias, the poem. The century opened with a considerable outburst of poetry, particularly In Britain, it was poetry with characteristics of its own. There was a new realization of nature as being an emotional relationship with man, an unconscious disregard of creeds, and an unrestrained approach to the deepest questions about life. As though almost unawares, the poet had gone out of the fabric of established and accepted beliefs and into a free universe. And a lot of this, as we find out later in this chapter section, looking at the rise of the Romantics, a lot of this is a reaction to the French Revolution and to that idea of natural science having discovered everything. You go back to nature. And that's very common. If you follow human history deep enough, whether it's this particular text or the story of civilization or any meta history, you'll notice that individuals and societies, all down through the ages, tend to oscillate between urbanization, artificiality, mechanization, and nature. And somehow there is, and I think this is very present in the English-speaking world for various reasons, certainly in America, the idea that somehow going into nature, getting away from the city, reboots one, to use mechanical language. It resets one. That's very, very much a romantic idea. The poems of this phase had a generally narrative thread that was reduced at times to a shadow, and they rambled gracefully, argumentatively, and variously. Shelley, confederate of Lord Byron up top here, Shelley, Keats, and Wordsworth are the outstanding names of this age of English poetic expression. Wordsworth was a very variable artistry. He gave voice to a mystical pantheism. I think you could say just as much about Byron and Shelley. A deep sense of God in nature. Shelley was the first and greatest of modern poets. By the way, I might have misspoken. Byron did not make Ozymandias. I was confusing him with Shelley. Shelley wrote Ozymandias. Shelley's thought was saturated with scientific ideas and the perception of the transitory nature of the political institutions of his time. Shelley's thoughts were saturated with scientific ideas, and his perception of the transitory nature of political institutions of his time was far in advance of any contemporary. Now, there's a mention made here, we see even, of Tennyson and Longfellow. And that Longfellow, the American Longfellow, was the American equivalent of Tennyson. So these are two poets, American, Longfellow, Tennyson, British, and they indeed lived and worked in that idea of the narrative poem. The narrative, I would say even hortatory or moralistic poem. We have Tennyson, Tennyson probably most well known for the Charge of the Light Brigade in terms of poems that people would know of him more than anyone. And I don't even think that's well known any longer, which doesn't mean that its forgetfulness is merited, but in just a state of modern letters. I would recommend, on a religious note, Saint Simeon Stylites, which is an extensive poem about the saint of that name standing on a pillar, as well as Saint Telemachus, the monk who ended the gladiatorial games in Rome. And if you read Ronald Reagan's mention of Telemachus, whoever wrote that speech at the National Prayer Breakfast in the 1980s clearly had just read the poem Telemachus, because he was drawing very specific details from the Tennyson poem, not any ancient hagiography. Longfellow, probably most well known for the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, but Longfellow also tried his hand at epic poetry with Evangeline and all sorts of individual poems. Now, Wells says that Longfellow is the American equivalent of Tennyson. In certain ways, yes, stylistically, certainly. But I wouldn't say there was any sort of copying going on there. And I don't mean that in a plagiaristic sense, but just stylistically, Longfellow and his generation of poets in the mid-19th century, were very much trying to forge an American identity in literature. And yeah, I mean, there are similarities to Tennyson or in general to the British poets of his day, but Longfellow was trying to really tease out what is distinctive about the American character. The individuality, the rebelliousness, look at, certain historical events like Paul Revere, whatever. Evangeline, the French and Indian War, trying to make this American saga, which is probably more remembered by Canadians than Americans. Most Americans would have never heard of Evangeline. But also just professionally, Longfellow was very much on the cutting edge. New England in the mid-19th century was obsessed about Germany, as I think most of the literate world was, as I pointed out before. And Longfellow, where was I going with that? Yes. Well, I don't know why I'm saying yes, but this is during the Unitarian crisis. A lot of that was influenced by certain spiritualism in Germany in the mid-19th century and higher criticism. But also the German university was coming into its stride, and America was trying to copy that. And Longfellow was actually responsible for introducing, or maybe he's guilty, leave it to you to choose the word, modern languages at Harvard. Longfellow taught Italian at Harvard, and that was tremendously controversial, the teaching of a modern language, Italian, at Harvard. It could be Spanish, it could be Chinese, it doesn't matter. The principle of teaching a modern language was something the Academy of the day was very hostile towards. I think in retrospect with great justification, because the dons at Harvard and Yale and all those so-called big shot colleges, they said, if we allow a modern language to elbow out some classical study on the part of our scholars, it's just a matter of time before everything else classical is tossed to the wind. And again, I don't want to bog down in this chapter of academic history, but it's very interesting because it does show an absolutely pivotal moment in educational philosophy here in America. And indeed, the people who were hesitant were very right to be hesitant. As we're watching, as of this broadcast, entire departments of the humanities being liquidated, and history departments and so forth being liquidated for what is, quote unquote, useful and practical. And it was that which caused great controversy. Longfellow also translated Dante famously during our Civil War in America, which adds a whole different level to the translation, especially of the Inferno. All right. Anyway, years ago, one of the early lectures I gave at Apocatastasis was about the fireside poets, of which Longfellow was one of them, along with Oliver Wendell Holmes' dad and Jonathan Greenleaf Whittier, and there's another one whose name is escaping me. I've also visited Longfellow's grave up on Author's Ridge. If you nose around YouTube, you might be able to find it. In any case, Wells then gets into, on this section 18 of the 19th century chapter, he then gets into history writing, talking about Carlyle and his look at the French Revolution. Something I've come across before. I should get into it more. I actually really want to follow up with Charles Reed's Cloister and the Hearth, which presents the still living issues between Protestantism and Catholicism in Europe, presented as a great romance with Thackeray. Malkohi. All right. So you have this, and then you have, in the next paragraph, a look at French literature. Walter Scott, that's who I was blanking out on. Walter Scott is also mentioned here. But when it comes to France, and these are really the two competitors to Germany, would be English and French literature. Germany is in a league of its own, but on its tail, artistically, is Britain and France. In France, the same necessities and curiosities that broaden the English novel from a mere story to a picture and interpretation of life inspired Balzac to the vast enterprise of his Comédie Humanité. At a great distance below him, Zola. And then we have Hugo, stands by himself, an exuberant, florid, bold, sometimes tawdry mind, erupting in plays, poems, novels, political disquisitions. I have a book in the other room in the boxes of books of all the ghosts that Hugo wrote down that spoke to him when he was doing seances and table tappings. Very interesting book. And it's titled Victor Hugo and the Spirit World. Just a background here. Again, this is why you need to break this down. You really can't read this book by itself without a context. I think you could read this a few times and begin piecing things together, but without a context either in class or with a larger reading, you're not really going to pick up on some of the nuances. So here, in this sentence, I'm going to read it again and make my point. In France, the same necessities and curiosities that broaden the English novel from a mere story to a picture and interpretation of life inspired Balzac, etc. What they're referring here is the long-standing practice in France, going back even to Louis XIV, the Sun King, and the Académie Française, to regulate the French language. So one of the reasons the English language novel is such a diverse, chaotic, amazing thing compared to the French, which seems very stuffy and in the corset of form, has to do with the Académie Française and the limitations that placed on French language and French artistic expression compared to the free-for-all, which was Britain and America. By the way, if you want a good poem by Victor Hugo, of which there's all sorts, Montana is a good one. You're in the liberal mood. Risorgimento mood, courtesy of Victor Emmanuel. Garibaldi. But actually, I think an even better poem than Montana is I Wish You. I Wish You. Look that up. I Wish You, Victor Hugo poem. Look it up and you can thank me later. The desire to know about life and what is happening to it, the disposition to question life closely and keenly that made the British impatient of the formal restrictions of poetry and elevated the novel and its cognate forms to literary prominence, spread through all European countries. The desire to know about life. So this is something that Wells brings up in this chapter in particular. The shift in the 19th century from poetry, which is strong at the beginning of the century. We listed all these fellas, Byron and Shelley and Wordsworth and Keats, and even coming from the previous 18th century, right? You begin the 19th century with the great robustness of poetry. And by mid-century, late century, you're absolutely in the ken of prose. Dickens, Longfellow here in America, Melville, Henry James, by the end of the century, you're solidly in prose. The desire to know about life and what is happening to it, the disposition to question life closely and keenly that made the British impatient, etc. So what is it about prose that recommends it over poetry? Is it industrialism? Is it the change of the calendar and the clock, favoring lengthy times of work and lengthy times of leisure? Is that what catapults the novel over poetry? Is there a spiritual change that's happening? These are interesting questions. I don't know the answer. I wish I did. There are probably several answers, in fact. But not all the readers of the 19th century were eager and curious, intermingled with the types and classes whose minds were filled with doubts and progress, or types and social strata and active resistance to progressive ideas. Side by side with the great and growing literature that provoked and stimulated, there was in Europe and America alike a vast output of written matter at every level of technical achievement, which was designed to amuse and soothe and reassure. And I'm sure poetry always does this. And I'm just checking here. Why on earth is my battery run down here? It says the battery is run down to 20%. But it's plugged in. Well, I'll get to the bottom of that hereafter. The point is, though, there is a shift here. And here's Sir Walter Scott mentioned. He's a figure of enormous contemporary prestige. And his enormous prestige will, like Lord Byron's, perplex posterity. He began his literary career as a poet who wrote 2 long, glib narrative poems, and then he wrote a series of historical romances glorifying the romantic past, exalting the loyalties of monarchy, the richness of tradition. These appealed enormously to gentlefolks and prosperous people, alarmed by the cold uncertainties of the changing and questioning present. He was the begetter of a wave of romantic and regretful fiction, not only throughout the English-speaking world, but throughout Europe. So here we have Wells once again editorializing. Right. I don't know if I'd say that about Walter Scott, but I'm always hesitant to negatively critique anybody. There's always good and bad and everything, but you try to focus on the good. But here, in any case, we do see, why it is that people want to be amused and soothed and reassured. Right? There are cold uncertainties, changing and questioning the present. We can talk about what? Nietzsche, talk about Darwin, talk about higher criticism. These are deeply unsettling ideas. Maybe you want to think about being a peasant in the highlands. And I think we'll bring the bird down here. There's still a bit more, and I have plenty of notes to get into. I don't want to shortchange myself for these notes because there are some interesting points about Mark Twain, about the political dimension, the shifting political aspect of things. Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, another great American light. I would not put Longfellow as some sort of imitator of British poetry. I would put Longfellow in the same unique mold as Poe, and for that matter, as Twain, or even Henry James, dare we say. So we'll look at this tomorrow. We'll also take a look at Dickens And again, bringing everything around to that horrible calamity, artistically and personally, of the Great War, which of course broods over the 19th century in retrospect, and also broods over any sort of literary analysis, because so many authors and artists, and in particular poets, died in the Great War. And so there's a particularly bittersweet, maybe poetical aspect of the First World War that you simply don't get with the Second, or with later conflicts, or for that matter, earlier conflicts. It's a unique dimension, the poetic dimension to 1914, because of all the guys that died. Anyway, we in fact do bring down the bird here. Thank you for joining in class on this project, day 295. I encourage you to check out in the description below our project page, knowing that we begin from day one with Adam and Eve walking the highlands. We begin at the beginning on the 31st of August as we set out on the great pageant of human history here at Apocatastasis. If you're really hungry for this, do consider enrolling. It really helps us out, and more than just materially assisting us, gives us more reason to get up in the morning, because this is such great stuff to get into. Anyway, thanks so much. It's been a long day, and I'll catch you down the line. Masalama.